It's my privilege to be the moderator of this final session of the day. We've heard a lot about human capital, so what we'd like to turn to now is connections between human capital and growth. And if you look at some of Gary's own contributions on this, it was to bring to bear issues having to do with bringing fertility into it, and the impact of fertility, growth, and human capital simultaneously, their interactions and how they played out. Now, to explore this topic further, we have three distinguished panelists. Two of them, I believe, were former students of Gary's. So we have Ed Glaeser and Claudia Goldin that, in addition to being distinguished economists, were influenced at Gary at the early stages of their career. And then the third one, Bob Lucas, who's a longtime colleague of Gary's. Excuse me? Okay. Yeah, we call Bob a student as well, I guess. That seems fine. Now, usually we're supposed to go in alphabetical order, but we're going to reverse that today. So, can I have Bob Lucas go first, then Claudia, then Ed? Thank you.
So Gary's work on human capital is just completely central to my whole take on economic growth. So I could just, everything I've written would be suitable. But I want to focus in on the growth implications of Gary's even earlier work on fertility, and I'll try to motivate what I'm interested in, and then by two slides. So here's a picture of Nigeria. It gives you the curves are the it's like a density function of income levels of people in Nigeria. And of course, we don't only have data on that, so these are things that are constructed with a lot of imagination, but a lot of care by Xavier Salai Martin. And they're the best. If you want information on within country inequalities, he's your guy, I think. Anyway, he's my guy. Now, these are densities, but they're not all integrate to one, so they're proportional to the population. So you can see from Nigeria, there's not much going on in terms of income growth. You can see a little bit of creeping toward the right there, but that's it. And there's a heck of a lot going on in fertility. The country has grown by more than doubled over this period, from 50 million to way over 100 million. So the Nigerians, now there's a lot to do that. There's a lot. Nigeria is much more productive. Their GDP has gone up a lot, but Nigerian families have chosen to take that out, respond to that with larger families, and hardly any of it has come out in terms of economic growth. Now, I want you to know, Nigeria is a very poor country, but you can see some very rich people, pretty rich people out there in the right tail. And there's more of them every year. But then you look at the poor people, these vertical lines are the $1 a day and $2 a day lines. The number of poor people in Nigeria is going up at the same rate. So that's a possible economy. And in my view, this picture, I could use it pretty well for any country in the world prior to maybe the 18th century. You have rich and poor, you have maybe pretty complicated societies, but the income levels of individual people are not growing over time. There's none of this 2% per year growth that we see in the wealthy countries. Now, if I were to look in other countries, you'd see smaller or less population growth, depending. This is just a Malthusian model that fits this perfectly. If something happens that makes you more productive, you take over somebody else's territory, or something gets invented, or it raises the wealth of the system as a whole, and then that fertility just drives you back to where you were before. And you can look at Japan. The areas under these curves, the red curves, you can't really. In the initial years of Japanese growth, there were quite a bit of fertility or population growth, but the population growth is completely taken. There's no population growing in Japan anymore. It's also interesting to see what's going on. The lower end of the income distribution is just being removed. There aren't any poor people in Japan anymore. So it's kind of the opposite of the Nigerian setting. And again, we could look at a lot of the successful economies. We'll have patterns much more like Japan, much less Malthusian, and much much less like Nigeria. So I've given you two countries and asked you to imagine what the rest of the world looks like, including the entire history of the human race. So it seems to me the central question now of growth theory, at least the one that interests me, is how do you move your country into, you know, the Nigerian Malthusian-like economies into the economies that the rest of us live in. And we've seen that going on at a fairly steady rate, but certainly not a uniform rate throughout the, you know, since the end of the colonial age. Now, you could say, well, that's just the demographic transition. Nigeria hasn't had it yet, and Japan has. You know, no student of Gary is going to stop with a labeling of the phenomenon and just give it a name and go on. You know, the idea is you're going to get inside the people who are making these decisions, Nigerian families and Japanese families, and look at what their options are and what their wishes are. And generally, I agree with Gary. People are people. I'm guessing Nigerians and Japanese have pretty similar wishes. But in any event, you want to get in there and ask, why is this happening? What do individual people have to do to bring out this, to bring a country through this transition period? Now, Gary was actually thinking about exactly this kind of question in his 1960 paper, not about the growth aspect, but it's called The Economic Analysis of Fertility. He was in his late 20s at this time. Like Jim, I'm just stunned at what Gary was doing. This is way after his thesis. And there he was looking at a survey. It was a demographic meeting. He started with a survey of families in Indianapolis. It's amazing what little data. He'd scrambled around for a different kind of data in 1960, but it was a far cry from today's richness of data. This data was stratified by income levels and number of children, and he could see that and it's shown in the paper, that family sizes do not in general increase with income levels. So it's not a Malthusian model. Didn't explain the observations in Indianapolis at that time. So at this point, I think all of us here probably know this. First of all, Gary does not just trash Malthus. He begins by saying he likes Malthus because Malthus is an economist. He says Malthus's famous discussion was built on a strongly economic framework. And then he says mine can be viewed as a generalization and development of his. So what he's going to do is maintain the logic of the Malthusian data, which fits a hell of a lot of human history, and add some other factor which explains how the modern world has gotten out of the Malthusian theory. And what he does is instead of having people have utility function with a number of children, they still do. More children are better than fewer, just from the pure utility point of view. And also how much you can bequeath, how much you can, well, he talked about the quality of children. So everyone talks about this as the quantity trade-off. And quality means basically education is right at the heart of it. But if you could leave part of your farm or something, that's good too. Now this theory of Gary's, it hasn't really changed. I'm going to describe various places where these assumptions is being different situations, but the underlying fertility theory hasn't really changed. He did a paper with Greg Lewis in 1973, which kind of worked out the math more explicitly than the original paper, but made a few changes. He certainly talked, his treatise on the family got him back into fertility decisions. But none of this work, I mean, all this work was interesting, but none of it really linked fertility choices to economic growth, which is what I want to do, or want to see somebody else do, is more like it. Okay, but this connection was made in the late 80s. Robert Barrow was in our faculty. He might have left by then, but he and Gary were pretty good friends, and they got together and did two papers on growth and fertility. And they took this kind of Barrow dynasty, which is a very nice way of linking generations in a simple dynamic model, and which is just what we're talking about. And then into that they put Gary's idea of the quantity-quality trade-off. And took a little adjusting to get him to fit, but they did it. And then now we have a model that has all the properties of a modern growth theory, plus it now has a fertility decision that people are making, and you can work that out. And they did, they were two classy papers, but they didn't quite get us through the demographic transition. Or the onset of sustained economic growth in countries that had completed the transition. So this was done in a paper, a 1990 paper called Human Capital, Fertility, and Economic Growth by Gary, Kevin Murphy, and Robert Tamura. And I remember talking with those guys at the time, and you could see it was an exciting project. And what this paper does, it exhibits a theoretical example of a transition from some Nigeria-like Malthusian economy to a Japan-like economy where people are concerned more with quality of children than quantity. And the model had the proper, both these equilibria both these positions were equilibrium. So it didn't, there was no, the theory could accommodate both the facts of Nigeria and the facts of Japan, and you could work out the transition from one to the other and what would bring it about. And the second topic of the paper had to do with for our purposes, we can think of quality of children as schooled, well-schooled children. That the return on schooling in their theoretical model is higher. The higher the more that my country is well schooled, the more I'm interested in making sure my kids are well schooled. So it's kind of a feedback business. If for some reason we start moving toward the high school equilibrium, that's gonna get reinforced, and people are gonna, that movement's gonna continue until we get to the end. If for some reason people decide that not, they could fall back into the bad equilibrium, or the Nigeria equilibrium. Now, I don't want to put anybody on the spot here. This is a theoretical model, and the authors have a long string of caveats at the end, but you can't help but noticing that what they've got, he's got this combination of sustained growth and productivity, and increases in schooling, increases followed by increases in fertility followed by decreases in fertility, that all those properties of the model are pretty much what you see in the Industrial Revolution. So I thought that was a pretty good ride from Gary's attempts to figure out some survey of people in Indianapolis to take us to an understanding of the Industrial Revolution. So.
Our next speaker is Claudia Goldin.
So central to any discussion of how families change as development proceeds is the economic role of women. So when labor and product markets are nascent, very undeveloped, husbands and wives often work close to home on family farms and in small businesses, in artisanal shops and the like. And fertility is often very high. But women also at that time contribute substantially to family incomes. But as markets expand and technology advances in firms and in households, things begin to change. Both men and women can earn far more in jobs away from their households. Men exit the household, their homes, for more remunerative employments. The family purchases far more cheaply the goods it once produced, and married women remain in the home and care for it and for children rather than producing goods for sale or for consumption. Income effects operate to purchase the leisure and the health of married women and children. But social norms also take shape in ways that constrain women to remain at home. These social norms, by altering preferences, increase measured income effects. As technology advances yet further, brain jobs supplant brawn jobs, and income and wages increase yet again, and women's education eventually advances. Fertility declines, and women eventually leave the home and enter the labor market, and household specialization is then vastly reduced. Thus, women's participation in producing marketable goods is U-shaped with regard to economic development or per capita income. At low levels of economic development, women contribute a sizable share of family income. At moderate levels of development, a substantial division of labor emerges as women retreat from producing goods that are part of a market economy, even though they are produced close to home. And at higher levels of development, they enter the modern labor market, and women can contribute considerably to family income. So the U-shaped function has been shown to exist in many studies. In one given here, it is observed for the period from 1890 to 2000 in a cross-section of 16 currently rich countries. And the relationship is retained with year and country fixed effects for these 16 rich nations. In a larger sample of 120 nations for the period from 1950 to 2000, we see the same U-shape, a much flatter one for Muslim majority nations. So my talk is going to use this U-shaped relationship between women's market participation in economic development and link Gary's work on social norms to his extensive work on the family and women's evolving economic role. The question is whether societies, when they're at the bottom of the U, form social norms that keep women out of the labor force. Using Gary's and Kevin's framework, do social norms put in place in a functional manner and acceded to by all parties remain in place beyond their functional usefulness? I recently went to Saudi Arabia with a team of researchers from the Harvard Kennedy School and the University of Chicago and elsewhere to explore aspects of the Saudi labor market. It is a University of Chicago economics department nightmare. Every fetter you can imagine, regulatory, religious, and of course, social norms. And my role was to figure out how to increase the labor force participation and employment among Saudi women. Saudi women cannot drive. There's no public transport system. They cannot mingle with men unrelated to them. And they must wear appropriate dress. That's just for a start. Deviation from accepted behavior is, shall we say, scorned. So I asked myself, how can Saudi women make a U-turn even if they can't drive? So I went to Gary. As Gary noted in Human Capital, he said changes in the gains from work for pay have had a more powerful effect on the behavior of women than have traditional ideas about the proper role of women. But then I asked, but what happens when traditional ideas about the proper role of women are more powerful and impede gains from work for pay? In Accounting for Taste, as well as in his 1988 AEA presidential address, Gary did acknowledge, of course, that norms, which are the common values of a group that influence behavior through being internalized as preferences, he acknowledged that there are these norms, of course, but he was very careful to warn us. He said, norms may be the deus ex machina to explain behavior that is difficult to explain in other ways. Don't go in that direction unless it makes sense, unless you can really show it. So I'm going to take that warning very seriously. So how do societies get stuck at the bottom of the U-shaped female labor force function? So let me comment briefly on the US case. In the 19th century, manufacturing became very brawn-intensive. It had very long hours, it was dirty, and it had noxious conditions. Social norms developed to keep married women away from these factories, to keep them at home caring for their children and their husbands and other things that went on at home. Well, as in the framework that Gary and Kevin developed, upper-class members of society promulgated, and that's the term they use, upper-class members of society promulgated a social norm that married women shouldn't work. The upper classes did so to ensure that working class men worked hard to support their families and didn't squander their money, meaning didn't drink it away, or rely on their wives to do work. And in doing so, these upper classes protected their property and reduced their taxes in support of the poor. So at the time, a married woman who worked in manufacturing or in a low-skilled service sector job signaled to the community that her husband was lazy and indolent, a drunkard. And the norm gave license to the community to demonstrate derision for her, who just was working. But why did the working classes go along with the norm? Why did women go along with it? Well, the reason is because at the time, working class women benefited from the norm. Their husbands would be compelled by social opprobrium to work. And the women, in turn, would not have to labor long hours in manufacturing jobs that had pretty terrible working conditions. And working class men may have gained a bit because their wives worked at home and were less accessible to other men. Thus, the norms were beneficial to all or most and were not simply imposed. And that is the framework in Gary's Accounting for Taste. As manufacturing jobs waned and as white-collar work emerged, the norms for some time persisted, impeding the increase of married women's work. Marriage bars emerged, and those are not places where married people drink. Emerged in certain white-collar jobs like teaching and some office work. when women tried to remain in these jobs after they got married, and these norms did eventually disappear as women increased their education and as the substitution effect eventually swamped the bloated income effect. And the income effect itself finally declined after the underlying reason for the norm disappeared and as women no longer acceded to the social constraints and made that known. So norms stick around for a long time, often lingering for generations and slowing U-turns. So how does one make a U-turn in Saudi? Well, that's clearly a longer discussion. But in short, my answer is to encourage the education of women in new areas, such as healthcare technicians and IT personnel, and to bring them into the labor force before they're married. Above all, the answer is education, for even in Saudi, most of the highly educated women actually work. They're teachers. We may not be successful in having Saudi women make actual U-turns in cars, although Uber is having a field day. When I first got to Saudi, I realized that I had to not have my usual sense of humor and irreverence for things. But I did say to someone, oh, the answer is 4 letters, U-B-E-R. And then when I got home, this was in the Wall Street Journal. But as Gary noted, the rise in wage rates as countries develop encourages married women to spend much more of their time in the labor force, which greatly weakens the traditional division of labor. I am convinced that even Saudi women will someday be making U-turns in the economic marketplace. Thanks.
Lars introduced me as someone who Gary influenced greatly when I was young, and that's certainly true. Gary certainly shaped my intellectual life when I was a graduate student here at the University of Chicago a quarter century ago. But to limit it to that feels deeply wrong, because in fact, Gary shapes my life every day. That in fact, the way that I think about economics, the way that I view the world is very much a reflection of what Gary gave me, both then and through his papers and through the interactions with him that I was lucky enough to have since then, for which I'm enormously grateful. And I think above all, there are 2 great lessons that Gary gave me, and I alluded to one earlier in my question to Kevin, which is, the first of which is just how incredibly important this job is, right? How incredibly important the task of being an economist, tasked with trying to understand the world around us is, and what an incredible blessing it is that this is our life. And the second of which is the redefinition of economics as a field. It is very rare to have a scholar who can actually truly redefine a field as Gary did with economics. But it is because of Gary that so many of us can look out at the world around us and think, you know what, I'll work on that. I'll work on some totally new topic that no economist has ever worked on before, and we're allowed to do that. It doesn't have to be productivity functions, right? It can be really anything, and Gary gave us that. But on the other hand, of course, Lars is really right. There was something special about being here with Gary in person. And that is in part why the University of Chicago was so special. That face-to-face interactions are just very, very powerful for delivering human capital. In some sense, that's an idea that I got from Bob in 1989 at the University of Chicago, who actually wrote about that. So it transferred face-to-face, the importance of face-to-face, and indeed, much of what I've written about cities is basically just reutilizing that stolen idea of mine. But it is something that feels very, very real, in part just because being around Gary was just so special, and you just got so much from him on a daily basis. Now, when I think about this history of this amazing university, it's clear, at least I think it's clear, that Gary experienced something similar in the 1950s, and that his redefinition of the field was, in fact, in some sense, a reflection of something that was in the air in the 1950s in the University of Chicago. And it's something that comes out of this interaction between Karl Popper and Milton Friedman that occurs in the late 40s at the first Mont Pelerin Society meeting. I'll just let you read this. Justice Milton's interview with David Levy from 1992, one of the major benefits that I personally derived from the first meeting of the Pellerin Society was that meeting Karl Popper and having an opportunity for some long discussions with him, not on economic policy at all, but on methodology in the social sciences and the physical sciences. That conversation played a not negligible role in the later essay of mine, The Methodology of Positive Economics. So this is the face-to-face meeting between Popper and Friedman that gives you Friedman's writing down scripting of a methodology for our field. A paper, in some sense, that defines economics not by the study of international trade or the study of business cycles, but on a clear use of scientific method to social problems, which is very much what Friedman does in his essay. And of course, once you redefine economics in this way, then it is Gary's genius to then think, well, if we're not particularly about business cycles, then we can be about anything. Right? So just the Friedman thing, progress in positive economics will require not only the testing and elaboration of existing hypotheses, but also the construction of new hypotheses, right? The construction of hypotheses, a creative act of inspiration, intuition, invention. So I like that both because it reminds us of what Friedman did in terms of redefining around the methodology, but it also reminds us of what an incredible task of invention and innovation, the crafting of new hypotheses can be. And of course, no one symbolizes that more than Gary Becker did, right? No one was more innovative and more skillful in coming up with new hypotheses that no one had thought about in fields of human endeavor throughout. And of course, it is a leap, but it is a leap that, as was said earlier, seems obvious ex post as much as it was completely obscure ex ante to Gary's redefinition of the field, right? What most distinguishes economics from other disciplines in the social sciences is not its subject matter, but its approach. Maximizing behavior, market equilibrium, and stable preferences used relentlessly and unflinchingly form the heart of the economic approach. Now, the Beckerian combination combines this redefinition of the field, the economics of everything, if you will, right? That is the heart of much of what he did, with his particular focus on human capital, which is in some sense the focus of what we're doing here. The economics of everything was in some sense more revolutionary. It was bolder. It was particularly oriented towards sociological problems, although, as was mentioned earlier, there is great political science in it as well. The human capital view was less revolutionary in a sense, right? It was building off T.W. Schultz. It was building off Walsh's capital concept applied to man, written in 1934. But it was also spectacularly right. In fact, it's only sort of unimaginable how right he ended up being in terms of the power of education to shape almost everything. And that's mostly what I'm going to talk about here. But I'm going to particularly talk about, the connection between education and politics, which in some sense builds on Becker as political scientist instead of a sociologist. Now, we talked a little bit earlier, and Jim gave a great talk about the private returns to schooling. But of course, one of the interesting things about the cross-sectional relationship between schooling and per capita GDP is it looks nothing like the private relationship between schooling and GDP. Right? The actual coefficient, if you just naively regressed log of GDP on total years of schooling, would be a 0.42 number, right? It's a 42% return per year of GDP. Now, that's 4 times, 5 times any private return that we actually see. Now, in normal settings, of course, we'd have to have a lot of discussion about omitted variables and reverse causality and a whole lot of stuff. But of course, we don't have to do that here because we know that human capital is really, really good, and it's responsible for at least some large share of this, because we're not going to disrespect the memory of Gary by doubting that and by getting all fussy about reverse causality on it. And then the question is why, right? How is it that you can have social returns that are so in excess of private returns? And when we think about the success of the focus on human capital, obviously it's about the very strong returns to human capital at the private level. But it's also about all these other behaviors that seem connected with human capital. And it's also about the fact that human capital is shown to be so instrumental in the success at the national level, at the city level, at almost any way that you look at it. Human capital is an enormously strong predictor of success. And it really doesn't feel unfair to argue that human capital is the bedrock on which the success of people, cities, and nations lies. Now, one interpretation of this, and this is the stance that's taken largely in the growth literature, is that this is about human capital spillovers of one form, that we get smart by being around other smart people, and that there are social returns to education because of this. But I think there's another view, which is that education is critical to good government for whatever reason. And again, I'm not going to get into all sorts of picayune issues of reverse causality or omitted variables here, but certainly if you looked at the relationship between education at the national level and the quality of government, you get a very tight fit. This is one of the many measures that exist in terms of the quality of government across countries in the world. And no matter what of the measures you look at, countries that are better educated are better governed. This is also true, by the way, within the United States as well. If you look at corruption measures across U.S. states, they are uniformly the highest in Louisiana and Mississippi, which are not high up in the human capital distribution of U.S. states. And there's a robust negative relationship between education and corruption measures. Now, when we think about why this would be, I mean, I think naturally, right, we turn to Gary's work on education. We turn to thinking about competition and democracy, which I'm not going to go back in again, but the Casey did a great job of reminding us of it. I actually tend to think that Becker and Stigler's 74 is one of the great papers ever written thinking about corruption. And when you think about sort of poor governance throughout the world, this is the central problem. And then, of course, his wildly cited 1983 paper on theory of competition among pressure groups. I think also this is something that is critical for thinking about issues in governance. One of the things that's particularly interesting about poor educated countries is that while it's in general true that wealthier countries, of course, have much larger scales of government, poorly educated countries do appear to be incredibly overregulated. And this is the World Bank ease of doing business thing, where in fact the low levels mean that it's, in fact, it's the low things mean that it's quite easy to do business, and the high ones mean that it's hard to do business. And as you can see, the poorly educated countries make it extraordinarily hard to build a factory or to start a firm, right? Which is what you're saying. I think one way to think about this is it's related to the returns to corruption that come from having lots of regulations. But let me end on sort of trying to apply a certain amount of Beckerian thinking to why would human capital improve government? So we have this fact that human capital is incredibly strongly associated with governmental quality. Why would this actually occur? Why would we expect this to come about? Obviously, there are the perpetual issues of reverse causality or omitted variables. Better governments may, in fact, do more to invest in education. There's not a lot of evidence actually to suggest that that's true, but it's certainly, at the level that I'm doing here, it's certainly a viable view. Supply of political leaders or bureaucrats. In less educated countries, it may just be difficult to find competent people to run government. The information of voters or protesters, other people who are politically engaged. More educated people may be better at knowing what's going on. The organization of citizens, and I at least take the view that this is hugely important. There is, I think, in my mind, a false division between social capital and human capital, right? That, in fact, social capital is human capital, right? So much of what we learn in school is the ability to connect with other human beings, to communicate, to form alliances, to work together, right? Which means that if you think about the ability to politically organize, it's going to be intimately tied to the education of the group. I mean, I think it's hard to imagine America's founders being as effective as at both tossing off British rule and then forming a coherent government if they weren't so well educated in 1776. And of course, the last view is, in fact, and this is a very Beckerian view, that human capital and rule of law are very strong complements. That, in fact, all of the things that you do in a complicated economy need rules. I think this is a nice way of thinking about this is Becker and Murphy on coordination costs and the division of labor. The more divided labor is, the more that you actually need tools to enable people to work together. So this is this is democracy and education. Again, it's sort of a move along a path from less educated countries that are rarely democratic to highly educated countries that tend to be highly democratic. And this is, this path of history, I think there are two arcs that can try and make sense of what I was trying to show, which is this general tendency of more educated places to be better governed. And one view is that over time, scattered investment in skills builds a community able to organize itself to defeat monarchs and sometimes to maintain democracy. And of course, the second task is much harder than the first task. It's much easier to topple Mubarak than actually create a well-functioning democracy post-autocrat. Both tasks benefit from human capital. The second view is that human capital shifts the nature of the economy from simple agriculture to complexity, with many more interactions, both of which need law, investments, and innovations, which create a demand for law. Similarly, despots, military dictators, may be willing to hand things back over to democrats more often when the gains from having a democratic rule of law government that enables trade to occur are higher. These two different views have different implications, for example, for the Asian model, right? So if we think about a model currently in which we have autocracies that are, relatively good on the rules of business, right? If the second view is true, then if we have a new autocratic model that still enables business to get done, there will be relatively little pressure for changing it, and that model can persist. If the first model is true, it means that there will be people in Hong Kong protesting, right, regardless of how well the current system is moving in terms of creating business. So they have somewhat different views for the real world. In any case, the fundamental point of this was I think it's a huge mistake, and I think it's a disservice to Gary's legacy to think that the impact of education stops at labor markets, right? It changes everything. And it changes everything not just privately, but socially and politically as well. And I think in some sense, our job in keeping Gary's legacy alive is to continue exploring and understanding those effects. Thank you.
So in the remaining time, first I was pleased that Ed in his talk, when he talked about corruption in government, he somehow Illinois and its governors got left off the hook, and Chicago aldermen were also missed in his observations. Instead, we focused on Louisiana. But anyway, he's clearly ignoring me here. So, so what I'd like to do once the panelists are done talking to each other is to.
I agree.
Could I interrupt here for just a second? I was wondering if first the three of you might want to share the interactions with the rest of us, and then after that, if we might open things up for questions. Is there a discussion here which we should be sharing?
Germany.
Yeah, Bob thinks I'm not doing a good job of explaining Germany in the 1930s.
Okay.
Which, meaning that it was an educated country that doesn't do too well on the democratic front.
So you also missed my rather flippant comment that you somehow left out Illinois governors and Chicago aldermen and talking about corruption in states. But anyway, we will not. What I'd like to do is to open it up for some questions from the audience. It can be directed to any or all of the panelists.
So Illinois is actually in the middle on corruption, in the middle on education too, Lars.
Oh, it is?
It's not an outlier on either dimension. Certain governors notwithstanding.
And aldermen.
Yes, an alderman.
There's a question over here.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed all the talks, but I had a question for Claudia Goldin. She gave a particular and I thought interesting story about why norms arose that inhibited women's participation in paid work in the 20th century, I guess. And I wonder how much success that particular story has when you look across countries. It doesn't seem obviously applicable to Saudi Arabia. And I think about countries, for example, maybe it fits China versus India. China had much more of a manufacturing boom than India did, and my impression is that there's been a greater erosion of barriers to women participating in paid employment in China than in India. But I'd like to get your thoughts on that if we know what the facts are. I don't know what the facts are.
I think that that 19th century and early 20th century manufacturing is very different from the light manufacturing that has come to much of Asia. And there are papers that show that, in fact, when this lighter industry occurs, when women are just coming out of, when small businesses are fragmenting and people are going into the marketplace, then you don't get that social norm, because there is sort of no way individuals would all accede to that social norm. So that's correct. Saudi is, of course, another case that one has to think about.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question.
So,
Derek?
so Claudia, I was surprised that you didn't mention contraception given your previous work, because it seems like that would be a key public policy thing that might differ between Muslim and non-Muslim countries, or traditional and non-traditional societies, that would be related to endogenous decisions on the part of women about investing in certain types of careers. And, given other things you've written, I was surprised that you didn't
Mm-hmm.
mention that.
This Saudi fertility has, I can speak about Saudi, not about all of the Muslim world, but Saudi in particular, we know fertility rates have plummeted. And when I was in Saudi for all of 2 days, there were many, many questions that I had. And pulling women aside and asking them what their contraceptive choices were was high on the list, but I rarely got to that. But I'm moving in that direction. Data from Saudi on just about anything is difficult to get. So some things you just have to get by pulling people aside. But that, of course, is a very good question. I don't have the answers, but something is happening even in the kingdom, and I don't know what it is. But one of the plans that I have about getting women into the labor force was, in fact, to bring them into what I called Healthy Woman Well Baby clinics, which, in fact, would have something to do with contraceptive choices. So.
Okay, well, with that, I would like to thank again all three of the presenters for a stimulating discussion.